Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ira Mukuti and Meena T. Pillai, women in Indian history.
Hello, good afternoon. Can you all hear me? I just wanted to clarify that Meena T. Pillai and I are in conversation. She's not a moderator. We are both going to be talking about our books. There wasn't going to be a moderator for this session. There was going to be a third panelist, Urvashi Butalia, who very sadly was not able to make her flight last evening. So you will have to make do with the two of us.
Hi, it's too warm actually. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us. I don't know for how many of you this is more interesting than cricket. I think there were a lot of cricket fans here, but we'll try to make up with whatever is possible. On that note, let's get into the topic, women in Indian history. Ira, shall I just make a few, because there is no moderator, we are trying to kind of look at this topic from our different books, the perspective of our different books, what we have covered, the ground that has already been covered. I particularly want to raise two questions to ponder about at this stage. When we talk about India and Indian, I think the first question that comes to me invariably as an academic is, whose India? Which India are we talking about? Which Indian are we talking about? Which Indian history are we talking about? Are we talking about official histories? Are we talking about women who could not actually make it into official histories, who fell on the way, whose voices are scattered or muted across centuries? So, women in Indian history is also about them, who did not make it into history textbooks, who did not make it into official versions of history. If you and I and Ira, if we are sitting here today, I think it's been a long journey, a journey that has been centuries old, fighting to get to a place to, sit in or share spaces like this, to make our voices heard amongst, literature festivals and culture festivals in the social and political geographies that we inhabit. So this is the first question. The second question is about history itself. Which history are we talking about? Or what is history? Are men's histories and the histories of people who are marginalized the same? Do we talk about, say, all history is about time? Are men's time and women's time the same? Is there a difference in the kind of, we talk about the chronos, the linear, histories of powerful people. But we are also, when it comes to women, we are talking about cyclical times. We are talking about time that is calculated according to menstrual cycles, for example, from one period to the other. Cycles that are painful, cycles that write or talk about labor that is unpaid, cycles that are about muted voices and marginalizations. So this is also a different kind of history that we are talking about here. And on that note, once again, a warm welcome. Over to you, Ira.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for staying on. When we first saw the crowds, I knew it was Dr. Tharoor and cricket. But I'm very happy to see a lot of you stay on here to listen to a lot of women in the crowd. That's very heartening. Meena has brought up a lot of very interesting points. What I want to begin by sharing with you is that I am often talked about the question of sources, and how I choose the women I'm going to write about. How rigorous are the sources that I use when writing about women in history? And the first thing that comes to my mind is that as a writer who in certain times of my career and in my books, I am looking particularly at women, is that I am not spoiled for choice, honestly. I am not wading knee deep in examples of women who have been written about in Indian history, for whom we have creditable written sources, for example. So where women are concerned, the obfuscation, the obliteration, and the ignoring of their lives is so complete and so thorough that I don't have the luxury of saying, I will write about this woman, but not that woman, because there's very scant evidence. I have to take whatever I'm given. That is actually the very sad state of affairs where women's histories are concerned globally. I think we are in agreement that globally women have been written out of science, out of history, out of every field of endeavor. So to illustrate that, I wanted to talk to you about one of the very first women that I wrote about, who is Amrapali. So she is a courtesan who lived in the 6th century BCE, and her life, she was an exact contemporary of the Buddha. Had she not been an exact contemporary of the Buddha, we would have never heard about this extraordinary woman, and we would have been told there are no examples from ancient India in this category of woman, and that would have been that. But because her life overlapped with that of the Buddha, and the Buddhists were some of the first great historical record keepers in India. They took down meticulous records of the Buddha's life, all his disciples, people who crossed his path. And luckily for us, not just Amrapali, but a bunch of other women crossed his path. But Amrapali is really interesting because she was a foundling, an orphan girl who was found in Vaishali, abandoned by parents or an orphan at birth, and she was taken in by this couple. And they must have seen something in her, maybe her great beauty, her talent, something, because the entire town of Vaishali invested money in her education, in her training. They hired dance teachers, music teachers to train her as a courtesan. There has been a fair amount of work done on this. We know that the courtesans of ancient India were a little bit, they were the precursors of the Tawais of Mughal India. And the geishas of Japan. They were very cultured, educated women. So Amrapali became a courtesan, and she commanded enormous respect and money. She was able to build tanks and endow temples, other structures, and rich and powerful men would come to spend an evening with her to seek her patronage. So she was this very powerful woman. And then the Buddha came to her town, and she fell under the spell of his teaching. And she would eventually give away all her great wealth, something which was really extraordinary for the time. She gave away everything she had, her money, her jewels, everything, all her paraphernalia of her life as this very elite courtesan of the town. And she became a bhikkhuni, a nun who followed the Buddha. And we know about this because in the Pali canon, written much later, there's an extraordinary document called the Therigatha. That's the Psalm of the Sisters. And these actually record the songs of the bhikkhuni, the women followers, the nuns of the Buddha. And we have their actual words recorded from 2,500 years ago, which is, it is not something to be taken lightly. It is like gold, because you really don't have the words of women directly in this manner. It's very, very hard. And these 25 nuns who write about their struggles and the reasons why they joined the Sangha, why they joined, the Buddha, the reasons are often very prosaic. So whereas the male followers, the monks, would write philosophical reasons for why they joined, how they wanted to find the divine, how they wanted to become one with the universe. So they had all kinds of philosophical considerations. But the women write about very prosaic instances of their life that they're trying to escape from. They are trying to escape from the drudgery of daily domesticity, from their horrible husbands, from their cooking pots, from their water pots. These very mundane details of their day-to-day lives. And that's when we remember that in that time, and for many centuries after that, women had very few choices in life. They became married, or if they didn't want to marry, they could renunciate the world. They could become Buddhist nuns was one of the ways in which they could escape just the simple drudgery of everyday domestic life. So, when I wrote the first story in Heroines of my historical women, I thought it important to bring back Amrapali because it's something extraordinary that there is a written record of her, but not just of her, of all her sister nuns. And so we can sit here in the 21st century and contemplate the kind of lives they have and what it took to be a heroic woman in those days.
Thank you, Ira. So when Ira speaks about Amrapali, I was thinking about my own book on effective feminisms in digital India. So I think what Ira was trying to trace was a certain kind of a trajectory of women's histories in the pre-modern kind of situation, where mine is more contemporary and rooted in the Kerala and the India of the 21st century. But then the histories are also amazingly similar. See, when Virginia Woolf asked that very critical question, did Shakespeare not have any sisters? Remember that question that echoed across the corridors of literary history. I think it is time, I mean, it's already far surpassed the time when we also ask, we should be asking, who are the women inhabiting the times of Kalidasa? Or who were the women who were writing at that point of time? Were women writing? Were women given the choice or the freedom to write? What kind of spaces did they inhabit? So when Ira was talking about Amrapali, I was thinking how in 2012 or 2014 or 2023 or 24 or 25, how do women write about their bodies? Because Amrapali, the courtesan, who was so versatile and so cultured, I mean learned and cultured in the arts and music and all kinds of things, I mean later renouncing everything to follow the Buddha, she took over a certain kind of an agency, that made her discard many of the things, the trappings of arts and culture, in order to go on a path that was austere, that was sparse. But in one sense, she was also taking control over her body, right? And here we are in 2025 talking about women's bodies that are bleeding, women's bodies where the bleeding bodies cannot be represented. We are talking about purity and impurity in 2025. We are talking about, the home may be as a safe haven where women should be confined, women's bodies should be confined. And then comes up this figure, this historical figure of Amrapali, who renounced everything that was comfortable to follow a different path. So are we really agential in 2025 is something that I think women today need to ask themselves. I think it's a critical question that we need to ask ourselves, because when we look at history, definitely there are women who took upon themselves this task of saying that, okay, here we are in history, but then we also have a voice, we have a body that will not dance to the tune of, received understandings and wisdom. So this is where I connect my own work with Amrapali, Ira's work, where Amrapali comes to haunt, comes to inhabit the spaces that you and I reside in today. Do we have the freedom of Amrapali? Is maybe at some point the audience will respond to that question.
Thank you. And Meena, I was just reminded that what I should have mentioned is that Amrapali was forgotten for thousands of years. Naturally, women's even recorded words are forgotten. Thousands of years, nobody really mentions it. In the 20th century, there is a Hindi language novel written, Vaishali Ki Nagar Vadhu, where she is completely recast. Now, like Meena was saying, Amrapali was a rare woman who had agency. She had agency to change her body and her experience twice. Once when she she became determined to become the best courtesan she could be, command the most respect, become so cultured that she could earn an enormous amount of wealth and respect. The second time when she gave all of that, shaved her head, took on the robes of a bhikkhuni, took a begging bowl in her arms and went out onto that dusty path, and we know how stepping out of the boundary of your home is dangerous in India. So she did this twice, and yet in this 20th century novel, she has become a shrieking harridan who has no more agency. She is just all the time crying and complaining to the people of Magad to come and destroy the city of Vaishali for having made her a courtesan, taking agency entirely away from her and saying how could she possibly have chosen this lifestyle, because by now in the 20th century, thanks to the colonial experience, courtesan had become associated with fallen women, prostitution. So you see how her entire story has become one of that, the typical shrieking harridan. The second interesting thing you were talking about, Meena, women's bodies and bleeding. And that is something that has interested me as well. From the time that I wrote my very first book on mythology, it happens to have been my fourth published work, but it is the first manuscript I wrote way back, 10, 12 years ago. It was when I became interested in the way in which Sita is projected in popular culture to all of us through TV serials, through Bollywood movies, through comic books, through TV advertisements. The way in which a particular kind of woman, very fair, her hair tied back, heavily laden in jewelry, smiling benignly. So this is the Sita of the way in which she's projected to us now. This perfect mother, perfect daughter, perfect sister. Everything about her is groomed, domesticated, and she fits so neatly into the Brahminical patriarchal mold that we are expected to then tell our daughters about. In exact counterpoise to that, I thought, I had two small daughters at that time, and I think the compromises one is willing to make for oneself. You are willing to curtail your laughter, you are willing to sit in a certain way, you're willing to wear certain clothes that hide your shoulders. You don't accept that for your children. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to parrot these same truths for my daughters and for other young girls. So I looked at the story of Draupadi. And Draupadi is exactly, at least in the popular image that Sita is projected to us, Draupadi is the exact opposite. She is dark. She spends 12 years in forest in exile. She throws away her jewelry and her beautiful silk clothes. She wears barks of organic materials, of leaves and materials like that. And she leaves her hair unbound. So bound hair is a sign of domesticity. She leaves her hair unbound. By that means, she is in fact calling to life in front of her husbands the deadly vision of blood. Because she has said, I will not tie my hair up, I will not become a good domestic woman until the Kauravas are destroyed and I bathe my hair in her blood. So for 12 years that her husbands see her, they see a woman drenched in blood. So this is, a very women's blood and women's anger, especially when they are tied together, is something extremely powerful. And so that was, something that I wanted to talk about in lieu of Sita and bring Draupadi's story instead to the forefront, to say you can be an angry woman, you can speak your mind, you can say things which are shocking to men, and you can still thereby be a heroic Indian woman.
I think, that's a wonderful take, because when my book is also, the two books that I wrote recently are about women's protests and how women with no voices at all, absolutely no voices in mainstream media, begin to take over and speak. And these are little voices that you see in digital spaces. Now, when Ira was talking about Amrapali shaving her head, there is a sartorial politics there that I think we are still, at this point in history, it's still difficult for us to take up. Because shaving off your hair is, of course, it's an act of, it's an act of piety, but it is also an act of rebellion, not conforming to the sartorial standards that have been set up by, society or societal values or majority value systems. Now, the point I want to make when you're talking about these two women is also the fact that we are sitting in a space like, Calicut, and if you look around in Kerala, there are many, many terrifying goddesses. We have goddesses of that kind, who are dark, who are swarthy, who are terrible to look at, with malas of skulls, and they do not fit into the kind of sartorial politics that was inflicted upon female bodies at a later point of time. They refuse to be part of those, extremely feminine kind of figures. They have resisted that for many, many centuries, and I see in them this kind of a resistance writ large on the body itself. not conforming to the fair and lovely style of dressing. But then, when you come to Draupadi again, for the first time maybe in history, we see a bleeding body on stage. A bleeding body that is rebellious, that is transgressive, that refuses. I mean, when I see that Draupadi, I also remember Mahashweta Devi's Dopti, where, that very, very, very interesting sentence that Draupadi says towards the end. Can you clothe me? After the Indian army has raped this tribal woman and she marches with her mangled, bloodied body onto the army, which is on the hillock, and she marches up and her body is completely covered with blood and her flesh is torn and dripping. She marches to the Indian army and says, and then the Senanayak says, put a cloth on her. Is there not somebody here? Put a cloth on her. Because the commander of the army cannot bear to look at a woman's bloodied body. And then she says, Mahashweta Devi's Dopti says, can you clothe me? You can unclothe me. But are you man enough to clothe me? So this is a question that, these figures raise. And probably that is what Draupadi was also trying to say. She loosened her hair and she said that until revenge is, that is where a woman becomes agential, powerful enough to wreak vengeance on the kind of treatment that has been meted out to. Now, Ira was talking about her own kids, and I too have an experience to share. The way, for example, in Kerala, where we beat and brutalize our girl children into conformity with the male gaze, is something that, of course, young women have begun to rebel and to change things. But see, I call myself a feminist, but there's a confession to make. When my daughter was very young, very, very young, and she would wear something that I felt if she received stares with that kind of a dress, she would not be able to handle it. So I would say, Tara, please don't wear that. Tara, please don't wear this and go out. And one day, my 7-year-old daughter stood up, looked back, stared at me on the face and said, Amma, in Kerala, every woman looks at her daughter with the eyes of a rapist. So that was my girl speaking out, saying that I refuse to be, part of this setup where my body is constantly under the gaze and I have to dress up to the gaze, right? So I think I still have a lot of hope, because Draupadis and Doptis will come back to haunt the corridors of our history, and there will be more and more rebellious women rising up to protest against, the stereotypical images that have been given to us. Yes, Ira.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear that about your daughter, truly. And to get women and girls like that, who have the courage to say these things, that's why these stories that we all write are so important. Because unless you have that example, unless you are motivated and you can say, look at these examples from my own past in India, why can't I be like that? So that reminds me, of the work that I've done on the women in Mughal history. So when I was starting to write this just a handful of years ago, we're not talking, the deep past or last century, most people thought, and I thought, that Mughal women were women who were sequestered. The Zenana was a place of, it was this dark and cloistered space from which women were never able to exit. They spent their lives aimlessly, not doing anything productive, dressing themselves up, spending all day trying to attract the Mughal Padshah. And that the women between themselves were, always tussling and fighting, and there was no camaraderie, and it was a intensely, at the same time, very lethargic and, decadent space, but also full of acrimony and hatred. This was really what I thought. It was what a lot of people thought when I began writing. And the stories that I came up with in Daughters of the Sun completely contradict this. and I won't go into all the details, but just to bring to your attention that because a lot of our history, especially 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, has overlapped with the colonial, advance into India, it means that a lot of our history is written through the colonial gaze. And so when British and European men came to the Mughal court, they couldn't see the women. There was distance from them through the zanana, through the barrier of language, through protocol. They were not allowed to meet them. And yet they sensed that they were very politically active. They realized to their own detriment that they would never get a trade contract made if they didn't send gifts to the reigning Padsha Begum, the important woman of the harem. And this really confused them because at the same time, at home in England, women had no agency. They were, as children, they belonged to the family, and when they were married women, their money was transferred to the men. They had no independent financial means at all. Yet, at the same time in India, these Mughal women had enormous wealth because, especially at the 17th century onwards, it was an extremely wealthy empire. So these British men were so confused and distracted also by the ideas of what must be happening inside the harem. I think unknown numbers of men spent time thinking about what sorts of things happened inside the harem more than was absolutely healthy for them. And they wrote what can only be described as purple prose for people back home in England were becoming increasingly interested about this great Mughal empire and its women. So the men who traveled here catered to that desire and wrote really lascivious things about Mughal women, about how they spent their time committing all sorts of sexual acts, that there was incest happening, all sorts of horrors, which the British lapped up and which in some way we have also inherited, and it entered our subconscious. Because when I started writing this book, even historians told me, Ira, don't waste your time. You will find no sources, no records about what Mughal women did. And they were both true and not true because the records are very scattered. You will not find a nice, neat biography like you will for Akbar, but you find lots of other records. You find buildings that they have made, you find inscriptions on certain sites, you find a few writings that they have left us, you find burial places where they chose to be buried, you see art that they have sponsored. And by putting all of this together through an act of love, really, what else can it be? You can sort of create the very textured, nuanced, and interesting lives they led. So the colonial gaze has also been something, as you can tell us about as well, how deeply it has affected, especially the way in which we view women in Indian history.
See, this is very similar to the burial of our matrilineal past. Today when we talk about the sari as the official dress, the sari and the blouse and all that, again coming back to sartorial politics, this is a land where women did not cover their breasts at one point of time. It was a matrilineal society where, androgyny was practiced. Women were polyandrous. So, we have very conveniently buried that past and we have moved on. But then that past also comes to haunt us in very many ways. See, for example, when the Britishers, you talked about that, the British colonial, jurisdiction, jurors and others, when they were in court, they did not see any women, which made them think that women did not have any agency. But then in Kerala, it happened the other way around, where the British were flabbergasted. Here was a matrilineal system with a matriarch as the head of the family, and they could not transact business because they could not come into the inner, sections of the ancestral house. So they wanted a male member of the family to go out and transact business with them, and that is how the Carnivore became, the senior most, the mother's brother, became so powerful. And we have the unique tagline of being the first people to legally abolish matrimony in Kerala. We did that through a series of reforms. And in the 19th century, imbibing to many of these colonial modes of life and colonial attitudes, we have our reformers saying, people like Sir C. Shankaran Nair saying that our children are bastards in courts of law and our wives are concubines. So this was the reason why matrilineal was abolished in favor of patrilineal initially and then patriarchy. But then this history is something that we don't want to bring up at all. So what I'm also trying to say is that there are very many burials, there are very many erasures in history that we need to retrieve and bring back. And that is the reason why my recent work, Gender in Modernity, my first chapter begins with the Yakshi. The Yakshi, that very potent symbol of transgression, of mobility. When there were women in Kerala at that time who could not step out, who could not, and there were rituals like Pulappedi and Mannapedi. You all know about that. So at a time when all these were existent, here was a figure who could navigate, the nights, who could walk the earth, who could, straddle a treetop, who could take a swing from one tree to the other, and who could claim the night as no other woman could. And look at the way we so brilliantly, we have all these myths and stories around Yakshiya Talakal, the way in which, we tried to curtail this mobility, because we just could not understand women with mobility, women who were fearless, women who had transgressive sexualities. But what was very interesting for me as I looked at the figure of the Yakshi was that the Yakshi was not nailed as with the heart, In the Western culture, their hearts are nailed. The vampires are impaled with at the point where there is a heart. But in Kerala, we nailed it with the head. I mean, the nail was put right on the head. And that, I think, is a very, very interesting historical marker that we just cannot accept thinking women who are intelligent, women who can talk, women who can talk back. So this was a figure of the Yakshi, and as I argue in the book, the Yakshi also is not just a transgressive feminine, it is also an image from the past that comes back to haunt the present. The Yakshi comes to haunt us today, not as a fearsome woman as we think her to be, but a woman who teaches us lessons in transgression and mobility. I think there are hundreds of Yakshis in the KLF, more power to them.
I'm fascinated to hear that, Meena. And, this is so true of one historical figure I've written about as well, Mirabai, of the Bhakti tradition. But her example also shows us how powerful is society's desire to put a woman back in her place, how hard it is to remain free. So we have the example of Mirabai. I'm sure you've all heard of her, 16th century Bhakti saint in North India, the only woman to be listed in the canon of Bhakti saints. And she did this incredibly transgressive things. Meena was talking about leaving the home, walking out. And she left her elite Rajput home. We don't yet know exactly, there's very few records once again. So we don't know exactly which house she belonged to. Was it Chittor? Possibly, but we don't know for sure. Whatever the details were, she left her marital home having refused to bow to their Kul Devi, the Devi of that family, because she was so in love with the deity Krishna. And she left her home and went onto the open path of North India, an extremely dangerous place for a young, unchaperoned Indian woman.
Ira, if I may interrupt, that is
yeah.
also the freedom to worship.
And of course,
The
there are
freedom
many
to
freedoms.
believe, the freedom to worship.
To worship, to not be a pativrat, to not stay at home. And Gandhi would later say she was a widow when she left. We don't know that at all. She was probably a young woman. But she was sanitized to such an extent. So she was a wandering saint with men and women around her, bhakts as well. This was the company she kept. She took off all her jewelry and her silks, and she had these coarse cloths, and she was wandering around North India for years before she died. Yet today, she has been sanitized so much in Rajput homes. There is a cardboard cutout figure of her in the Chittor family, puja area, which is such sort of great metaphor for what happened to her. And in that, she is this pale, austere, bloodless looking woman in pure white. Now, how you stay with white clothes on the open road is something only a saint can tell us about. So she has these pure white clothes. She's sitting in contemplation. Clearly a widow, who was not subject to any sexual transgression when she was on the open road. So, and Rajput women will tell you, yes, we think she is a great icon for the Rajput women. We name our daughters Meera, but we do not tell them to emulate her. We do not tell them to do the same thing. So, it is so deeply ingrained, misogyny is so deeply ingrained that I, encourage all of us to look at our lives, look at what passes off as cultural mores, what passes off as Indian tradition, and make our little changes in our lives. For example, when I got married, I did not change my name, I have kept my own name. But then when my daughters were born, I didn't think to challenge the way in which they were named. So they carry their father's name as if I have absolutely nothing. They emerge from their father. So little by little, we ourselves can make changes in our families, in our lives. Think about the way we do things under the sometimes, very misleading idea of culture, of great Indian culture and tradition. So, these kind of examples that Meena and I are talking about today are, I think, a chance for everybody to reflect.
Yeah, I think on that note, we have around 12 to 13 minutes. We would really like to open it up to the audience. I'm sure that there are many women here who have voices that they need to be heard. Please.
Come on, ladies, we're counting on you here. You must have some questions. Otherwise, we'll go on talking.
Hello.
There's a lady right there next to the camera.
Hi. Here. As you are well aware that the women's studies domain as a discipline and the women's movement in India, especially during the 70s and 80s, it emerged as a twin movement as coined by Veena Mazumdar. And I'm also a student of women's studies in Calicut University. And in my experience, I have felt that the movements of women's studies and women struggle that began as a twin movement has departed very much. And the women's struggle, especially coming from the working class movement, is very far from the academia, I have felt. Could you comment on that?
I think we have this mistaken notion that activism is something that is out there in the street and people have to fight larger battles. I think each and every woman here is fighting a battle. That is also part of their activisms. And to make the separation, it is almost as big a mistake as making a separation between the public sphere and the private sphere. To say that feminism is all about being out there and fighting larger political battles, which is something that I have argued in my book. I think the battles that I fight in my classrooms are equally important. My classrooms are spaces where I can change the minds of generations. How does it become any less important than the term activism that is given to certain kinds of activities? I think each and every woman here who maybe posts a picture of the food that she cooked every day, or cooks every day, is undergoing or is writing a certain kind of a resistance, saying that here is an example of my labor that is so invisible. That is again a kind of an activism. So to think that these are all not activisms and there are larger flags under which we need to unite as feminists, I think is the biggest mistake of the 21st century. We are all feminists in our own rights, fighting our little battles, trying to make our little voices heard, somewhere or the other. I have students who are fighting losing battles inside the very confines of their homes. And I think they're extremely political battles. So to this micro and the macro, the divisions that we make, for me sometimes are problematic. And I really think we need to get out of that. I think each woman is struggling here, and we need those battles also to be taken into account.
Thank you so very much. And just before thanking you, I really want to thank KLF. Virtually every day, virtually every time slot has dedicated at least one session to hearing women's voices. This is outstanding. Bravo. And thank you so much for all of the men that are sitting in this room, because really it's so wonderful to have so many men listening to this session. Now back to you ladies. The question I have is, I have been working on Nair Metali, the 1830s reform, and the impact it had on economics of women in Kerala. But getting access to resources, to data, to information, and I did my degree back in 1990, it was very challenging. I'm just wondering, how do you go across, Ira, collecting the sources? It must be like archaeology, or more like tracing ghosts. So if you can talk a little bit, I mean, you did when you did your story piece on Marapalli, but if you can just talk a little bit about the process, because that would be very, very useful to those of us academics who are working on these issues. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Yes, absolutely, especially where the histories of Indian women is concerned, and I'm sure women around the world, but one particular, I think, challenge we have here in India is that a lot of our history was not written down. We have a long tradition of oral histories, and because we have inherited the scientific legacy of the West as well, we have an overwhelming importance placed on written texts. So for a long time, I was tempted to ignore anything which was non-written, because I have a scientific background myself in a Western institution, and my own internalized thinking was that anything which is non-written is not a source, is not a valid source. And I have just come across, an article by Professor Harbans Mukhia, who says not only oral stories, but we need to look at oral cultural memory and see how they fit into the overall story of history telling. So for example, when I was writing Akbar, my biography of Akbar, I came across many myths which I kind of, wrote aside in a very sort of cursory manner. Things like the Jodha Akbar story, of course, I went into in great depth, but things like the idea that there was a Navratna at court, there was never a Navratna at court. The idea of the Deen-e-Ilahi, that he created a religion, that is also not true. The Akbar Birbal stories are also not true. But there is something behind them. There's a cultural memory that is somehow very valid because it is so tenacious. So it tells us something about how people think. So I think now I will also be looking at these stories much more closely. I also look at oral texts more now than I did in the beginning of my career. Because, for example, for somebody like Mirabai, the number of pads which are attributed to her are hundreds, endless. And if we were to believe each was written by her, actually, she would be a polyglot who could head a university of languages, because they are across all the North Indian languages and more. But instead of disregarding it, what we can say is that a great deal of disenfranchised peoples felt a kinship with her and added their pads to her story of being cast aside, of their wretched existence, of many other challenges that they faced. So this is one, So when I was writing my book, Heroines, I said I'm not going to cast aside all the padas that have been attributed to her. We have to give her some kind of ownership of these, in terms of at least the example she set, even if she didn't write them herself. So, it can be quite nuanced the way we look at evidence, I think, especially for women. And then what I do is I cast a really wide net. So I go far beyond the archives and the texts. I really like to travel in a place so that I look at the buildings that they have lived in and that they have patronized and that they have died in. So for example, Jahanara Begum, I grew up my whole life in Delhi, not knowing that she was buried in the Dargah of Nizamuddin Aulia. It's a small, humble grave, open to the sky, the way in which a Sufi is meant to be buried. And that's when I discovered that being buried, this is not a humble grave, because there's no big structure, there's no marble edifice, and there's no, grand entrance. it is a really powerful tomb to be buried so close to the sacred precinct of the greatest Sufi saint of Delhi. It means that you are incredibly powerful and also ambitious, and you also had a message to give to posterity. So it is also the reading of sources that you have to do in a certain context, right? Somebody else may have said, oh, there's just this one grave of hers, no big deal. But she is buried so close to Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah, so that when the Qawwali sing, I often think their praises are actually flowing over her tomb, and somewhere her spirit is getting, succor from this. So there are many, many ways of looking at history.
I think if I can add to that, the question was very interesting because there's definitely a patriarchal logic to archiving in India. It's not that there are no archives. There are plenty of archives, but the inaccessibility of the archives and the way inaccessibility becomes a ploy for researchers not to get to the archives. So I would exhort all researchers to break those ploys and strategies and plunder our archives in order to come up and unearth more and more powerful stories.
I'll just add that's extremely right. For example, Gulbadan Begum, Babur's daughter, wrote an extraordinary biography of life from within the Zanana. And it was written at the time of Akbar. Akbar commissioned it. He said, everybody who has first-hand knowledge of having lived with my father Babur, with my father Humayun and Babur, please write down your memories, your records. And Gulbadan was one person, his aunt, that he went to. And we have this extraordinary document, I think the single most important document from a Muslim woman from within the harem. And it was never used. Abu al-Fazl did not refer to it. It was not referred to by subsequent historians of the Mughal court, and it was completely forgotten right through the centuries till it was rediscovered in a bunch of archives at the British Library, then translated into English, and yet again forgotten in the 20th century till Ruby Lal discovered this amazing text and wrote about it in a very powerful book called Domesticity and Power in the Early Mughal World. And reading her book, I, in the 21st century, had access to this 16th century document which had been ignored for 400 years by male historians. So just one simple example of how easily this story could have been lost and forgotten. I think we have time for last question.
You didn't mention anything about Sultana Razia, the first and the only Sultana.
I did, and she wasn't Sultana, she was Sultan. She refused to take the sobriquet, the female sobriquet. So she was known as Sultan Razia. So yes, she is the only recorded, Muslim woman ruler who ruled in her own name in the 13th century. So again, a very, very amazing woman who ruled at the time of enormous flux, enormous volatility amongst the descendants of Iltutmish, the Turkish slave empire. And she managed to rule for 4 years despite facing all kind of challenges from the gulams of the court, the Turkish gulams who had been brought to India. She found resistance from her own brothers, from her noblemen, and yet she managed to carry on for 4 years before she was finally killed on the battlefield. In the end, she took the assistance of an African slave because she felt he would be less threatening to her because he was by origin a slave, what we used to call Abyssinians, Ethiopians, because he had no kith or kin, he had no family connection, so he was completely loyal to Razia Sultan. But somehow the writers, in the subsequent years and centuries, made him her love interest. That is another ploy that men do. They will make somebody your love interest and just make you an object of desire. So watch out for that. Whenever you see somebody who is only cast as this object of a man's undying love, it's very suspect. So this is what happens to Razia.
Then it becomes easy to call you immoral because, you were in love outside the limits of love.
Exactly.
Which happened right from the vindication of rights of women, right?
Yeah,
from that book onwards, we see that in different forms.
I think we may have finally one last quick question from the gentleman in the front row. in the contemporary world, you know. Okay, so the gentleman said that I've written a number of books dealing with women in history through the ages. If I was to write about contemporary women, who would I write? I feel that is a terrible trap that I will not fall into. I have come very unwillingly from the 15th century to the 18th century in my latest book. The closest I would come, I think, Meena might talk to us more to this, is some of the women in the nationalist movement who really tried to fight against caste strictures, you know, hoping to find through Christianity, you know, sometimes through conversion to Christianity, to find liberation from caste strictures, and was somehow still never quite able to do that. I would write about Savitribai Phule,
There are
maybe.
hundreds, yeah, there are hundreds of women. I mean, like, there's so many powerful women who inhabit our own time. So,
I think we've run out of time. We can carry the conversations outside. I'm sure the speakers are waiting to come on to the stage. Thank you so much, Meena. Thank you to
so
all
much.
of you.
Thank you. An amazing audience. Thank you so much.